Disclaimer. I found this book. I'm not sure who the weirdo is that owned this book, but it is very strange.
Carnal Men, The Don Juans Among Us, by Pat Vallan. Forward by Guy A. Heyman, Ph.D. Read by Black Dust.
Publisher's statement. During the summer of 1973, we have been witness to another incidence of American irony. In June, the Supreme Court handed down a decision which was designed to temper public depictions of human sexual behavior. Less than 2 months later, however, the Gallup poll indicated that the sexual revolution had made Americans significantly more tolerant towards sexual conduct than they had been 4 years ago. In effect, the poll delivered credence to the Supreme Court's majority opinion that the sexual revolution of recent years may have had useful byproducts in striking layers of prudery from a subject long irrationally kept from needed ventilation. In line with the findings of the nationwide poll, and assuming that the court's opinion is correct, then what, we feel we must ask, is the justification for attempting to restrict something that had been useful to society? Rationally, we are unable to find any such justification. To us, it is like the government banning an oral antiseptic because some people can't stand the taste. The fact that it may kill germs and prevent disease is shunned to decide. Stretching the analogy a bit, it would seem to be another classic example of how the emotional left hand manipulates the reasonable right. In our search for justification, we took a hard look at the sexual revolution, hoping to pin it down for absolute identification. This task, we discovered, was well nigh impossible. Every professional researcher and every layman has his or her own opinion on the meaning of the term. To some it means a spiritual collapse, an abandonment of all moral principles. To others it represents a legitimate rebellion against a suffocating Puritan ethic. To still others, it reflects an enlightened generation's conviction that sex is a normal function and that they have a birthright to pursue it openly without feelings of guilt or shame. The reader can draw his own opinion of the sexual revolution by looking at specifics. During the past 20 years, there's been a marked and precedent-setting shift of attitudes from conservatism to liberalism towards more areas of sexuality. The areas include premarital sex, sex and marriage, sex education in the schools, public discussion of sexuality, nudity in motion pictures and on stage, portrayals of sexual conduct through the arts and letters, toleration of homosexuality, understanding the compulsive deviant, and the pros and cons of legalized abortion. When we look at the above areas and consider that layers of irrational prudery have been struck from portions of them, we are compelled to wonder if all or some of them are those to which the justices had been referring when they coined the term useful byproducts. If indeed they are, then we surely cannot comprehend rationally why we would institute action intended to stall or reverse this desirable trend. We realize for many people, change is a most difficult process to experience. It often means the breaking down of many customs and traditions, however restrictive and uncomfortable they might have been. But change, particularly mass change, usually reflects society's dissatisfaction with the past and a move toward betterment. We see it all about us, in science, industry, politics, and lifestyles, only instead of change we call it progress. As exemplified by the word revolution, the change in our management of sexual behavior has been rapid, a virtual upheaval. It came about because our society could no longer healthfully function under the weight of centuries of religion, hence social, hence political oppression. Our intelligence, reinforced with psychological and scientific data, informed us that there was no justifiable reason for fearing or being ashamed of our basic sexual drive, a human instinct second only to survival. So, for the first time in our brief history, we Americans begin to live with our sexuality openly and honestly. But as we have already pointed out, change is painful for many people. Newness frightens them. They would prefer to cling to the traditions of the past, even if those traditions are harmful to their best interests. In short, they fear change in the future so much that, rather than chance it, they would choose to wallow in their own familiar, predictable misery. Those who fear the most cry out the loudest. It is their voices that are being heard and acted upon. Supreme Court admittances and Gallup polls notwithstanding, a layer of prudery has been redraped over our society. If we are to check a future avalanche of similar layers of prudery, a man-made catastrophe that will surely bury our constitutional rights, then we too must be heard. We urge you to write your representatives in government to air your views on this critical political issue. Your rights as an American citizen are in danger of being compromised by self-serving political interests. The best way you can protect those rights is to exercise them. The publisher.
Hey, it's Black Dust, and yeah, that was a little weird, but stay tuned, because it's going to get even weirder when we read a message from the author, a foreword, and chapter 1. So let's see if you can stand it.
Forward. Tales of unrequited love have long been panaceas for the ills of publishing houses and motion picture companies. Whether in a book or on the screen, we have seen countless stories worked around the theme of one principal character failing to return the love of another. C'est la vie, we say, as we watch the action unfold. It is a part of life, this unreturned love, so much so that just about all readers and viewers can easily identify with it. And with patron identification, of course, comes commercial success. A Don Juan type personality is the unrequited in Unrequited Love, and he is very much a vital part of the real-life socio-sexual scene. This fellow, full of fears as he is, compensates for his own neurotic hang-ups by using other people, women, as feelingless objects. He will devour everything they have to offer, emotional as well as physical, and return practically nothing. Books on sexual behavior, such as the one you are holding in your hand, usually isolate and look at the nuances of one particular aspect of sexual behavior. For instance, it is not difficult to purchase 3 separate books, one each on the sexually aggressive man, the sexually promiscuous man, and the satyr. In this particular book, all 3 types of men are lumped together. As a result, we have a comprehensive, sometimes appalling picture of a genuine cad, the Don Juan. Before we work our way deeper into this syndrome, we would like to clear up the confusion that often exists in people's minds regarding the main difference between Don Juan and the Casanova. In casual conversation, I have heard them linked as brothers in the art of lovemaking. Such is simply not the case. Don Juan was a fictional bounder. Casanova was a real-life lover. Casanova was an 18th century nobleman who, to be sure, was promiscuous, but who handled his women with tactful admiration and respect. He returned tit for tat the emotional and physical affections that he received. When an affair had been consummated, he left behind him a wistful lady, perhaps, but certainly not a broken heart. He was an expert lover, a master at the art of sensual manipulation. Don Juan, if he had ever lived, would have been intimidated and cowed by the very shadow of Casanova. Despite his preoccupation with conquering women sexually, the Don Juan is not necessarily an oversexed man. Many behaviorists believe that he uses his carnal activities to satisfy intense emotional needs. These needs are usually on an unconscious level and vary considerably from individual to individual. For instance, one Don Juan may need constant reassurance of potency because of inner doubts about his adequacy. Another may engage in excessive heterosexual activity in an unconscious attempt to deny a latent homosexual feeling. Still another may carry on a dozen affairs at one time as a means of warding off anxiety stemming from emotional conflicts, or as an escape from the threatening home or business problems. A fourth may be compensating for feelings of failure, disappointment, or frustration. Others must keep proving that they are attractive to women because they believe they are undersized, homely, or socially inept. And if we really want to get Freudian, some psychoanalysts feel that men who seek conquest after conquest may be unconsciously avenging themselves against all women for disappointments experienced with their mother in early life. The pathetic part of this creature's lifestyle, and we believe it would be appropriate to describe it as compulsive lifestyle, is that he rarely experiences any gratification from the relationships he establishes. But in the process of making them, he derives secondary satisfaction from setting up dramatic situations, outwitting his rivals, and overcoming the ladies' hesitations. He is a sexual charlatan and an accomplished conniver, a hunter simply unable to establish a deep and meaningful relationship with his quarry. And watch out if he doesn't get his way. A display of temper and or violence is not foreign to his makeup. If ignored or backed into a corner, some Don Juans will do anything to regain the attentions of his chosen sex object. Thus, we can see from the information presented above, a professional sketch of this man does not make for a very pretty picture. Nevertheless, because he does play a prominent role in socio-sexual matters, he is worthy of close examination. This endeavor, we feel, has been accomplished by this book. Guy A. Heyman, Ph.D. Chapter 1. Fact or Fiction. The cad always makes good copy. If you need further corroboration on this point, ask the opinion of any news person, bartender, movie mogul, or hairdresser. And should there still be lingering doubt, put the question to a good, solid, and working actor. In which part would you rather be cast? St. Francis of the Assisi or Rasputin? The more deplorable his character, the greater is the cad's charisma. And when his particular brand of caddishness is directed towards the sexual exploitation of women, he has attained the acme in fascination. Women must also share some of the responsibility for the persistence of this image. With the passage of time, her sexual fantasies of abduction and rape by a cruel and arrogant Arabian sheik have merely been replaced by something more akin to a Hells Angels gangbang across the street of a Yamaha instead of the saddle of an Arabian steed. The legendary status to which such a cad may be elevated is nowhere near explicitly illustrated than in the legend of Don Juan, the greatest sexual rogue of them all. His appeal has not been limited to the sensation seeker, for the diversified talents of men of the caliber of Moliere, Mozart, Byron, Stendhal, and Bernard Shaw have combined to immortalize Don Juan, and the name itself has passed into common usage to denote a heartless and fascinating philanderer. For those who have forgotten the legend of Don Juan, let us refresh your memory. Don Juan was a fictitious character derived from folklore, a dissolute Spanish nobleman who seduced any female who took his fancy, or, if she was immune to his advances, was not averse to a little forcible rape. He took the same pride in the number of hymens he had ruptured as the gunslinger took in the number of souls he had dispatched to their maker. The screams of one such outraged lady brought her aged father running to her rescue, and being a man of great honor and little sense, he challenged Don Juan to a duel. To no one's surprise, the old man lost. Apart from thinking that the old man was a dolt for engaging him in mortal combat, Don Juan had no appreciable response to the incident. Remorse was not an emotion that dogged his turbulent path to destruction. After innumerable incidents of retching, cheating, and general mayhem, we find Don Juan in a cemetery, hiding from the vengeance sought by those who have been incensed by his Machiavellian practices. Here he comes face to face with the statue of the man he had killed, and who unfortunately still appears to harbor feelings of resentment toward him. The statue threatens the Don Juan with eternal damnation, and Don Juan charitably invites it to dinner. Then, later that evening, the statue clunks into his dining room. The cat adamantly refuses its demands for repentance, but agrees to accompany it to a place of the statue's choosing. He offers his hand as a sign of good faith. This proves to be a foolish move, for unable to escape from the statue's fatal grip until it is too late, Don Juan disappears into a holocaust of smoke and flames, heading in a general downward direction. The first play ever written about Don Juan was El Burlador de Sevilla, The Rake of Seville, written in 1630 by Tirso de Molina. This play is the basis for libretto of Mozart's opera Don Giovanni. It is believed that Casanova, the great lover, whose image is often confused with that of Don Juan, wrote a few of the lines and gave his expert advice on the atmosphere of the play. De Molina's play portrays Don Juan as an arrogant, witty, vital man, blasphemous, courageous, and defiant, and an unregenerate seducer and villain to the end. It is interesting to note that this has remained by far the most popular of the Don Juan plays. Almost unknown now is the play of José Zorrilla, written in 1844, which romanticized and cleaned up the character of Don Juan, allowing him a serious love interest and a final curtain, heavy with repentance and salvation. This absolution, of course, adds a supplement to the original assertion that this incorrigible cat has more charisma than the one who has been watered down by remorse. For those males who pride themselves on being a Don Juan, there is a blueprint against which they can gauge themselves. The blueprint is an aria in Mozart's Don Giovanni, sung by Don Juan's servant, Leporello. After naming the countries of England, Italy, Spain, San Marino, Arabia, Dalmatia, Helvetia, and Canto as some of the bases of Don Juan's operations, Leporello quotes the exact number of times his master had indulged in sexual intercourse in each of these countries. The grand total was 2,215. Considering the conditions of travel in the 17th century, this was no mean physical achievement. Leporello elaborates further on his master's sexual adventures. There are barmaids, basket weavers, countless countesses, princesses, every possible condition, occupation, form, and age, all arouse his gallant rage. Nowhere in the area is there any suggestion that Don Juan ever showed an inclination toward love, tenderness, or even a mild affection, nor does it seem that physical or mental attributes are a requirement. Ill or healthy, poor or wealthy, plain or pretty, dull or witty, high-born, lowly, scraggy hags or beauties, be they female, they're his duties, in a service that you know. But perhaps the lines that are most revealing of Don Juan's attitude toward women are these: but the most of all, he savors uninitiated favors. From this graphic description of the lifestyle of Don Juan, it is obvious that he stopped at nothing. He was like a locust crossing a field of femininity, and he devoured females of every size, shape, color, and age who stood in his way. A kaleidoscopic view of all Don Juan's sexual activities would provide a rich and diverse panorama of sexual practices that would delight the heart of any dedicated sexologist, ranging from the Oriental girls with their subtle arts in love-making, trained from birth to pleasure men, so that their delicate hands can play on the erogenous areas of a man's body with such exquisite refinement that he could be driven out of his mind by desire, to the full-bodied sensuality of the Arabian beauties whose gyrating hips and bellies rouse a man to the heights of sexual ecstasy, and then on to the warm-blooded Latins from Italy and Spain, and a cool challenge of the Nordic types. Whatever drove Don Juan to his interminable couplings, his insatiable need for sexual conquest is not known. We have no information on his upbringing apart from the fact of his noble birth. Whether it was lust, pure and simple, hate, masochism, or sadism, a driving need to be loved or to find love himself or lose himself, we will never know. It may have been a combination of all of these factors. Today, however, we have a wealth of information to explain the functioning of the Don Juan prototypes, as well as some of the women who fall prey to this kind of male. Through literature, both factual and fictional, and through the records of analysis of psychiatrists, social workers, marriage counselors, and law courts, the ghost of Don Juan saunters with a diabolical smile on his face. For when all the information was analyzed, we are left with the reality that the Don Juans of the world, far from being ideal lovers, when stripped of their erotic glamour, retain but a shell of the abysmally insecure, frightened individual. Dr. Lester A. Kirkendall states in his article on sex drive in the Encyclopedia of Sexual Behavior, papers by psychologists and psychiatrists reflecting both psychiatric research and clinical experience emphasize that compulsive or obsessive use of sex, which by many would be regarded as evidence of a strong sex drive, is the result of emotional instability and immaturity in personality. In reporting the results of studies carried out on promiscuous males and females, the Psychiatric Service of San Francisco City Clinic reported, contrary to popular belief, no evidence was revealed to indicate that this problem, promiscuity, is produced by above-average sex drive. In fact, the majority of habitually promiscuous patients use promiscuity in an attempt to meet their problems rather than an attempt to secure direct sexual satisfaction. A later report by the same clinic on promiscuous men said, in nearly all cases, this behavior appeared to be a result of conflicts, inadequacies, or disorganization within the personality. Incapacity for sustained love, relationships, or impairment of that capacity was revealed by almost every patient. Active hostility towards women was present in varying degrees among some of the men. Since the preoccupation of a Don Juan is with his sex drive, it might be advisable at this point to define the term sex drive. It is a term often used loosely and therefore can be subject to many interpretations. There can be no doubt that the Don Juan possesses a very powerful sex drive, but the mechanism that propels them is not located solely in the penis. Psychologists and sexologists hold many contrasting opinions concerning the basis of the sex drive. They are unable to determine which factor, psychological or physiological, has the more powerful effect on the individual's sex drive. Many professionals believe that the sex drive is purely biological in nature. For example, in 1945, Theodore Reik stated, "The crude sex drive is a biological need which represents the instinct and is conditioned by chemical conditions within the organism. The urge is dependent on inner secretions, and its aim is the relieving of physical tension." In 1957, Dr. Ernest Harms equated the sex urge to a physiological need for elimination. However, Dr. Kirkendall writes that no one denies the presence of both components in the sex drive. He further states, "An increasing number of persons are coming to regard psychological components as very important, and probably of considerably more significance than the psychological component, in determining the urgency of the sex drive in a normal person." Kirkendall subdivides the sex drive into three sections of capacity: what one can do, performance, what one does do, and drive. What one strongly desires to do, sexual capacity, he states, is determined by the ability of the nervous and muscular systems to respond to sexual stimuli by orgasm and to recuperate from that experience to the point where orgasm can be again experienced. In other words, capacity is dependent upon three factors: arousal, ejaculation, and the return to ejaculatory capability. The element for arousal need not be defined. It could be the proximity of a naked lover, or it could be something less direct, the sight of an erotic drawing or movie, the reading of an erotic novel, or even a preoccupation with a private sexual fantasy. Whatever reason stimulated the penis to erection, capacity can only be measured after ejaculation has taken place, either through intercourse or by masturbation. Performance, states Kirkendall, will ordinarily vary according to physical and psychological factors. Few, if any, persons perform to full capacity. Don Juan was obviously one of the very few. If a man is ill or recovering from an accident, his sexual powers will naturally be diminished to some extent. Overtiredness and consumption of too much alcohol will also be debilitating. Psychologically, a man with normal sex urges can temporarily lose all sexual feeling if he has suffered a personal tragedy like the loss of a loved one, or a setback like the termination of his job. Sometimes even confirmation by a certain kind of female can make him lose an erection, even though in the company of other women he could have continued a final ejaculation. A memory, an odor, a thoughtless remark can reduce a penis from full tumescence to total slackness. Kirkendall completed his breakdown on sex drive. Drive, he concluded, is the strength or the intensity to which the individual wishes to perform. Drive seems to be very largely a psychologically conditioned component and may vary considerably from individual to individual and from time to time in the same individual. Throughout his own psychological conditioning, a male can remain seated in his chair and yet experience an entire gamut of sexual pleasure, from desire through erection and to ejaculation without the presence of a female. He can imagine that a woman is kneeling at his feet filleting his engorged penis, or that he is surrounded by women whose only aim is to satisfy his every sexual need. He can imagine that he is lying between a woman's thighs listening to her ecstatic cries as he performs cunnilingus on her. Or he can imagine himself as a superman performing sexual acts beyond the endurance of a man. And when the dream is at its height, he will masturbate himself to a climax. The same ability will enable a man whose wife is a mediocre sex partner to endow her with an imaginary seductiveness and sexual fire that will allow him to experience the height of his sexual pleasure. The third dimension of the sex drive is at the mercy of all psychological traumas that occur in childhood and adolescence, even continuing into adult life. It is inevitable that these will affect the total sexual male regardless of his purely psychological components. It is from such traumas that the Don Juans of the world emerge. Traumas caused by parental disciplines or lack of them, or by adherence to religious beliefs or society's demands, many of which have proven to be deleterious to a man's mental health and development. Aside from the effect of any purely personal problems that a Don Juan of today may have to deal with, he has to contend with the climate passed down through the centuries that has surrounded men's attitudes towards women. A climate so saturated with condescension, contempt, hatred, and fear, that it is, perhaps, to the credit of the male of today that the Don Juans are not in the majority. H.R. Hayes has written a book about this subject entitled The Dangerous Sex, The Myth of Feminine Evil. He writes, "Until very recently, except for sporadic rebels of both sexes, the public and comforting position has been that women are naturally appendages of men, scarcely more than a tail wagged by the male ego." The blurb on the front page of the book paints a grim picture. The horrifying rejection and persecution of women in the Middle Ages, the stereotype of the femme fatale, and the split image of a woman as virgin and prostitute all add up to a fantastic picture of masculine hostility towards women. The Hebrews have a prayer that must stick in the gall of any spirited Jewish woman. "I thank thee, Lord, for not having created me a woman." Folklore from all over the world abounds with equally flattering stories aimed to promote this image. From the Bedouin groups who believe woman was created from the sins of the Satans or from the tail of a monkey, to the version of the South Slavs who insist that a dog ran off with Adam's rib while God wasn't watching, and the best God could come up with when he chased the dog was its tail. And that became woman. Not content with vilifying women through myths, man then seized on that tiresome monthly event, the menstrual cycle, to vent his spleen and build his superstitious fears. Germaine Greer, in her book, The Female Eunuch, devotes a sizable portion to hatred. And in her very first sentence, she lays it on the line. Women have very little idea of how much men hate them. As if to support her statement, from a former San Quentin inmate convicted of rape comes to the statement. Many whites flatter themselves with the idea that the Negro male's lust and desire for the white dream girl is purely an aesthetic attraction, but nothing could be further from the truth. His motion is often of such a bloody, hateful, bitter, and malignant nature that whites would really be hard-pressed to find it flattering. This was written by Eldridge Cleaver, who admits that he became a rapist consciously, deliberately, willfully, and methodically. Germaine Greer talks at length about cunt hatred. She gives ample evidence of it. The unfortunate girls found strangled with their own stockings and raped with bottles are the victims of male fetishism and loathing. If morgue doctors revealed what horrors ended up on their slabs, we might have worse evidence of the survival of cunt hatred in our society. According to Jenny Fabian in the book Groupie, a woman experienced in the art of performing fellatio on her lover usually feels that cunnilingus is less groupie and will not insist on her partner's reciprocation of the oral copulation. Miss Greer concludes her chapter on loathing and disgust by stating that the universal sway of the feminine stereotype is the single most important factor in the male and female self-hatred. She continues by saying that until woman can accept herself as she is, without the frills and perfumes of the Madison Avenue image constantly projected before her as worthy of emulation, she will continue to apologize and disguise herself, while accepting her male's pot belly, waddles, bad breath, farting, stubble, baldness, and other ugliness without complaint. Springing from the warped misconceptions about womankind passed down by father and son and accepted by wives and daughters, come to the Don Juans of today, silently offering a myriad of reasons for their debauchery, but outwardly proud of their record and seduction, bragging of their power to render women helpless. The image of Don Juan created by De Molina is underscored by Otto Finichel, who describes a Don Juan. After having made a woman, he is no longer interested in her. First, because she too has failed to bring about the longed-for relaxation, and second, because his narcissistic needs require proof of his ability to excite women. After he knows he is able to excite a specific woman, his doubts arise concerning other women. An unconsciously homosexual man, for example, may be aroused by sexual contact with women, but not satisfied. He then vainly seeks satisfaction in more and more sexual activity. Arnold Carlin talks of the misogyny and mistrust of the icy Don Juan. Since women are exploiters, they should be exploited first. Today there is a tendency to make of Don Juan a latent homosexual. Helen Gurley Brown is more flip and amusing in her evaluation of Don Juans. We might include them with the creepies, but I think they deserve a category of their own. After statements like, a Don Juan is patient, a Don Juan's drive and attention to detail are awe-inspiring. A Don Juan is unbelievably romantic, not true. A Don Juan is the only man who doesn't squirm when you have hysterics. He considers it a vote of confidence. While making impassioned avowals of his fidelity, he manages never to let you forget how irresistible he is to women. Miss Brown concludes, he is sick in the head, of course. It would seem then that a closer viewing of a Don Juan would reveal a compelling but not very prepossessing portrait. Chapter 2.
Okay, that's it. How'd you like it? It's very strange, right? Chapter 2 coming.